Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing abilities, or both? That's for you to decide. If you've ever played Vanilla or Burning Crusade, you may be familiar with the concept of priest racial abilities. These were a set of spells given out to priests based on what race they were. Each race had access to 2 of them, and they were mostly unique, although there were a few duplicates among them. Eventually, these were deemed too much of a balance issue, and in patch 3.0 they were all either removed or baked into the class as a whole. This may seem reminiscent of the racial abilities that all classes have access to. Players have long complained about being forced to play a certain race because its racials are just that good. By and large, I've found these claims to be hyperbole. If you're not in a cutting edge guild or gladiator or something, the impact that your racials have are really not worth considering. I've always said just play what you want, you'll be fine. And so I was always sort of saddened that priest racials were lost to us. As someone who mained a priest during the Burning Crusade, I loved these things. As one of the few troll priests around, it made me feel unique from all the blood elves and the few undead that were there. Racial identity as a whole has been sort of on the decline as WoW has gotten older. This is in large part due to there simply being way more playable races than there used to be, but also I feel Blizzard tends to neglect racial focus, and of course, in cases like this, balance tends to win out over flavor. Which is a real shame if you ask me. Not only did these abilities make you feel unique, but I feel they also hold the potential to help solve other problems. Over the years, classes gained more and more abilities, and to avoid bloat, have had a good chunk of those abilities pruned. If some of these were just made into class racial abilities, then we could avoid having them removed entirely from the game. But yeah, that's just me. In relatively minor cases like this, I'm always going to advocate for flavor over absolute balance parity. But I recognize many people feel the opposite, and they think throwing out balance for the sake of something as trivial as flavor is stupid. Again, I think both sides have merit here. But for funsies, I thought we could just run through all the priest racials that did exist and what happened to them. First off, we have Desperate Prayer, which was available to dwarf and human priests. This was just an instant self-heal on a 10-minute cooldown. As you may know, it got baked in as a baseline class ability, though with a much shorter cooldown. And it is one I couldn't give 2 hoots about. It has its use, and I certainly do use it, but it's just a boring spell, which is why it was perfect for humans. The other human priest racial was Feedback, a 3-minute cooldown that applied a 15-second buff to the priest. Any spells dealt against the priest would cause shadow damage and burn some of the attacker's mana. I imagine this was mainly useful in PvP. It doesn't seem like the most exciting ability though, which is why, as far as I can tell, it was just completely removed in 3.0. Dwarf and Draenei priests both had access to Fear Ward, and hoo boy, this is probably the most noteworthy one. It would, exactly as the name implies, ward your target against one fear effect. Originally, it had a 30-second cooldown with a 10-minute duration, which seems insane. Mind you, back in Vanilla and TBC days, your tank being feared was a big deal, and there weren't a ton of counters to it. So yeah, this was definitely the most overpowered priest racial, and it sort of gave Alliance players an edge. Which is why with patch 2.3, this was actually made a baseline priest ability. Its duration and cooldown were both set to 3 minutes, which made it substantially less powerful, and effectively made it so you could never have more than one target warded at a time. It remained part of the priest base kit until Legion, when it was finally removed from the game. To replace this ability for Dwarves and Draenei, they introduced Chastise. This would deal a small amount of holy damage to your target and incapacitate them for 2 seconds. Of course, as an incapacitate, any damage would cause the target to wake up early. It had a 30-second cooldown, and in this iteration it only worked against humanoids. It was removed in Wrath along with all the other racials, but would come back with Cataclysm as a baseline priest ability renamed Holy Word Chastise. The humanoid restriction was removed, and it remains in the game to this day. It has a 1-minute cooldown, though as a Holy Word spell, you can reduce that cooldown by using your other abilities. The other ability available to Draenei players was Symbol of Hope. This was a 5-minute cooldown that restored mana to all of your party members. In Wrath, this ability was given to all priests and renamed Hymn of Hope. It's nothing too crazy with that cooldown, but it's definitely useful, and I've always been glad to have it. The first racial that Night Elf priests had access to was Star Shards. This was a 15-second arcane dot applied to your target on a 30-second cooldown. This gave Night Elf Priest exclusive access to arcane damage, and is honestly one of the most flavorful spells on this list. It was removed in patch 3.0 and never seen again. The other Night Elf spell was Elun's Grace, a 3-minute cooldown that for 15 seconds would give you a 20% chance to not be hit by melee and ranged attacks. This one strikes me as seemingly very weak. For a 3-minute cooldown, that is not a lot of mitigation. And so with 3.0, it was removed and never seen again. Moving on, we have Touch of Weakness, which was available to Undead and Blood Elf priests. This was a 10-minute self buff that would trigger when the priest was a victim of a melee attack. The attacker would receive a small amount of shadow damage and a 2-minute debuff that reduced their melee damage. Again, this sounds like it was only useful in PvP, and it sounds like it was moderately powerful in that context, but I'm not entirely sure. With Wrath of the Lich King, it was removed and never seen again. The other undead priest racial was Devouring Plague. This was a 3-minute cooldown that applied a 24-second dot to your target that dealt shadow damage and was considered a disease. I believe that prior to Death Knights, this was the only disease effect players had access to. The fact that it's not a magic debuff meant that not all healers could dispel it, and of course it just fit very well, especially with Shadow Priests who are already a dot-based spec. In 3.0, it was changed to a baseline ability. In patch 3.2, it was changed from a cooldown to a rotational ability. With Legion, it was removed, and with Shadowlands, it was reintroduced. In its current iteration, it functions as Shadow's primary spender ability. The second Blood Elf Priest racial was Consume Magic. This was a 2-minute cooldown that would remove one of the priest's own magic buffs and return some mana to them. The actual usefulness of this is probably debatable. If it removed an important buff, you may find yourself having to reapply it anyways, which not only sort of negates the point, but could also screw with the 5-second rule of mana regen, which was very important for priest healers during the Burning Crusade. But at the very least, you could use it towards the end of the fight if you were running low on mana. Losing one of your other buffs for just a tiny portion of the fight is obviously less detrimental. This was another one of my favorite priest racials. It's such a blood elf thing. I need my mana fixed, so screw whatever I have to give up to get it, you know? Again, with 3.0, it was removed and sadly never seen again. Lastly, we have the most important priest racials, the troll ones. Probably the more useful of the two was Hex of Weakness. This was a spammable ability that you could place on as many targets as you want that would apply a 2-minute curse debuff. This would slightly reduce damage caused and reduce healing received by 20%. Basically, it was a less effective Mortal Strike. However, even if you had a Mortal Strike affecting your group, this was far from useless. Because it had a 2-minute duration, I would always throw it up on bosses that had healing effects. That way, even if your normal Mortal Strikes fell off, you would still have some healing reduction in place. And of course, the fact that there was no target cap gave it a bit of a niche as well. And let's not forget that this was a curse effect, something that's generally only available to Warlocks. And like with diseases, not all healers could remove it, although mages could. Again, Wrath came around, it was removed, never seen again. And lastly, we have Shadow Guard, which is probably my favorite. It was very simply just a shadow version of the original Lightning Shield. It would last 10 minutes, have 3 charges, and deal some amount of shadow damage to attackers, with charges requiring a few seconds in between to trigger. Again, not super useful, at least in PvE. I believe it could trigger certain talents like Blackout, which made it useful, but it just looked so freaking cool. It was probably the coolest looking priest racial there was. And, you guessed it, 3.0 removed it forever. So while priests definitely embraced the concept of racial spells more than any other class, paladins did have one similar set of abilities during the Burning Crusade. Alliance Paladins were given Seal of Vengeance. This would cause your melee attacks to apply a stacking holy dot to your target, going up to 5 stacks. Judging with the seal would simply deal holy damage based on how many stacks there were. And the Horde equivalent, or rather the Blood Elf equivalent, was Seal of Blood. This would cause your melee attacks to do additional holy damage, but 10% of that damage was dealt back to you. The Judgment would deal holy damage, and 33% of that damage back to you. Generally, Seal of Vengeance was considered better for tanking, and Seal of Blood better for DPS. In 3.0, Alliance Paladins were given Seal of the Martyr, which was a clone of Seal of Blood, and Horde Paladins received Seal of Corruption, a clone of Seal of Vengeance. In 3.2, the DPS seals were removed, and in 4.0, the tanking seals were removed. And the only other ability I can think of that sort of follows this paradigm is that Horde Shamans have Bloodlust and Alliance Shamans have Heroism. These are, of course, functionally the same, except that Bloodlust is way cooler. I don't imagine we'll ever go back to having racial spells. Just the baseline racials already get enough controversy. And I even saw that Season of Discovery Phase 4 added a quest chain where priests can unlock access to all of the other priest racial spells on one character, which just seems kind of lame. Like, if even a version of Classic is moving away from this concept, you know it's pretty much dead, which makes me sad, but probably makes most people happy. It is what it is. For this week's drawing, I decided to go with Prophet Velen. Originally, he was sort of a whatever character. It was kind of neat that he, Kil'jaeden, and Archimonde formed this triumvirate of Eredar leadership before the other two joined the Legion, and the uncorrupted Eredar became known as the Draenei. But I think Velen's stocks really shot up with Legion. Just his whole dynamic with Illidan was very fun to watch. You know, Velen was very beholden to the light and prophecies. Illidan was far more of a skeptic. And by the end of the expansion, Velen, this millennia-old character, learned to expand his worldview. That scene where he says goodbye to Illidan for the last time was really touching. You could tell the two of them really respected each other. Anyway, as you probably saw, it is not easy to draw hooves. I struggled for that quite a bit, and I'm still not entirely satisfied with how that came out. For the background, I just went with the Exodar, although it's kind of a simplified version. The middle of the drawing was already getting kind of busy, and I didn't really think I could fit anything in there cleanly. So yeah, I think that will wrap things up. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next week. Bye-bye.